Hello and welcome to the Car Care Nut channel. In today's video, I'm going to continue my series on how Toyota engine controls work. Today we're going to be covering oxygen sensors and air-fuel ratio sensors. But before we get started, if you're new to the channel, welcome. Consider subscribing. Check out some of my other videos. If you're a returning subscriber, thank you so much for watching another one of my videos. And without further ado, let's dig right into it. Let's talk about oxygen sensors first. This one is, as the name says, here's an example of an oxygen sensor. It's a sensor that measures the amount of oxygen in the exhaust. Let's talk about that a little bit. So you remember in previous videos of this series, we talked about a lean condition and a rich condition and how the engine computer is trying to keep the mixture at that perfect stoichiometric, whatever word we talked about. So the oxygen sensor is another input to the computer to after the whole mess happened, the oxygen sensor will tell the computer what happened, what's the result of all the meetings and all the mess that you had to make that stoichiometric. So the oxygen sensor will measure oxygen content in the exhaust. When you have more oxygen, that means the combustion is lean. You have less gasoline, more oxygen. A lot of that oxygen didn't get used in the combustion, so it came out of the exhaust. If you have a lot less oxygen, that means the condition is rich. That means all the oxygen or a lot more oxygen got used up and more raw fuel came out because the combustion is rich. That's the very basic operation of this, or not operation, but the idea of this sensor. These oxygen sensors, they don't work when they're very cold. They just don't respond very well. So they have a heater built into them, and that's about how far we're going to go into their construction. So speaking about oxygen sensors, let's talk from what really matters in the real world about them. Their voltage reading. These oxygen sensors, they introduce a voltage reading to the engine computer for review, if you would. Remember, this is also an input. The computer has no way of commanding this sensor to do anything other than just receive the reading that it gives. So this sensor ranges from 0.1 volts all the way to 1 volt, or actually just under 1 volt. 0.9, 0.95, very close to 1 volt. The middle is the perfect medium. When the voltage starts going low, we go into the lean side. When the voltage rises all the way to 0.9 or closer to 1 volt, the computer will understand that we're running too rich. And we're going to cover in a little bit in this video, towards the end, what does that mean for our whole operation. But right now, let's just focus on the O2 sensor so we understand it. Now, having said that, I want to bring your attention to one thing with Toyota. Toyota doesn't use only oxygen sensors, and you might have heard the term air-fuel ratio sensors. And people often wonder, well, what is that? This is actually an air-fuel ratio sensor in front of me. Yes, I did tell you it's an oxygen sensor, because to our eyes, when they are sitting next to each other on a table, they look identical. They have the same number of wires, they look the same, but they operate completely different, which takes us to air-fuel ratio sensors. People are often confused by them. They don't know the difference between it and a regular O2 sensor. And let me start from the beginning. Air-fuel ratio sensors are used in Toyotas for a very long time. I don't remember the last Toyota that had a regular O2 sensor. And you will know, closer to the end of this video, we'll talk about where they are positioned and how they're arranged in the car. But now let's focus on the air-fuel ratio sensor. We talked about the O2 sensor, low voltage, lean, high voltage is rich. The air-fuel ratio sensor, it is often called in the aftermarket world wide-band O2 sensor. And that's basically what it is. It just has more range. It gives a very much more precise voltage, so the computer can make these micro adjustments. Not only make big adjustments, it can make those micro adjustments and know okay, are we rich or lean? That's what the NO2 sensor would say, but an AF sensor would tell it how rich and how lean are we? Are we just a little bit lean, or too much, or middle, or 3/4, or 1/4? Where are we exactly lean, or where are we exactly rich? So the voltage reading, and this is what matters here. We're doing this for diagnosis purposes. So you guys with DIY mechanics and everybody watching this video, you'd understand how these cars work, because you can't fix these, you can't diagnose these if you don't understand how they work. So the air-fuel ratio sensor normal voltage is around 3.3 volts. It can go up to 5 volts, it could drop to 0. Let's talk about that for a bit. So the air-fuel ratio sensor voltages react the opposite of oxygen sensors. So the higher the voltage, the more lean it is, and the lower the voltage, the more rich the reading is. That's where it gets confusing, because they're reversed. Oxygen sensors are the opposite of air-fuel ratio sensors when it comes to voltage reading. Now, the air-fuel ratio sensor also has a heater to heat it up, make it actually work. These sensors don't work, they're not very accurate when things are cold. They need that heater to heat them up quick so they can start reading. So now we understand the difference between an oxygen sensor and the air-fuel ratio sensor. You just need to understand the voltages and what they mean. Now, air-fuel ratio sensors, anything over 4 volts, we're starting to get into a territory that the computer doesn't like. Anything under 2.5, 2 volts, the computer doesn't like that. So it needs to stay within a specific range. So keep that in mind when we get to one day, get to a video of advanced diagnosis where this will all come into play. But for now, let's keep things very simple. Now we know what the differences are between those two. Let's talk about how they actually mount in the car and how they're distributed. So you will hear the terms bank 1, bank 2, bank 1, sensor 1, bank 1, sensor 2, and all this mess. Or upstream sensor, downstream sensor, left and right, and all these confusing terms. Well, let's dig into this and talk about how these sensors are distributed. Engines have banks. They're identified as banks where the control of the computer is divided. So in case of a V6, one side of the cylinders, 3 cylinders, on one side are bank 1, and one side is bank 2. So the engine is split in half. Typically, on all Toyota engines, 4 cylinders are one bank. The only exception is 2001 to 2005 RAV4. It had 2 banks, 4-cylinder engine, 2 banks. Bank 1 was 2 cylinders and bank 2 was 2 cylinders. The most confusing engine to work on, because any other engine would be one bank that's a 4-cylinder. But let's talk about what makes bank 1 bank 1. Bank 1 always contains cylinder number 1 in the engine, whether it's a V8, V6, whatever the case may be. Bank 1 contains cylinder 1. And that actually applies to all cars, not just Toyotas. But we're going to keep it Toyota focused here. Having said that, every bank will have 2 sensors. Now, some cars will have 3. We'll talk about that in a bit. Every bank will have an AF sensor and an oxygen sensor. The AF sensor is directly after the exhaust exits out of the engine, out of the exhaust valve into the exhaust manifold. That sensor is the main input to the computer of what happened in the combustion. Well, I put this much gas, we had this much air, and I think I got everything right. But was it? That AF sensor tells the computer, gives it like the report card. Hey, buddy, here's how you did. You did horrible, or you did great, or whatever the case may be. The report card of the combustion. Here's what I see. So that is the primary sensor, and it is actually a vital sensor to the correct operation of the car. And it is directly after the exhaust exits, before the catalytic converter, or upstream of the catalytic converter. So now we know bank 1 or whatever bank, sensor 1 is always the sensor right after the exhaust exits the engine. immediately before the catalytic converter, upstream of the catalytic converter. Bank 1, sensor 2, is always an oxygen sensor, not an AF sensor, and it is used for a completely different purpose. That sensor, downstream of the catalytic converter, or sensor 2, after the catalytic converter. And all that sensor does is give the computer the results, again, another report card of how the catalytic converter is doing. We will cover that in depth for the catalytic converter in an upcoming episode of this series. But for now, let's get back to our banks. So, in a case of a V6, we have bank 1, sensor 1. That will be an AF sensor on bank 1 at the top, right after the exhaust exits. Sensor bank 2, sensor 1. That's on bank 2 on the other bank of the V. As soon as the exhaust exits, bank 1, sensor 2 is behind the catalytic converter, after the catalytic converter, downstream of the catalytic converter, and then same on the other side. So that's the basic layout of these oxygen sensors. One car that I know of has 3, a Toyota, 2002 to 2006, Camry 4-cylinder, California emissions. Not all of them, some of them will have a third oxygen sensor because it had 2 cats. They needed for some emissions reading, for some emission requirement in California. We all know California can be special with emissions. They had a third sensor to monitor the second catalytic converter. That's one unicorn, if you would. So we're not going to cover too much on that. It basically does the same thing. We'll cover that more when we talk about catalytic converters. So having said all that, let's talk about the most important thing with all this mess. This is the most important part of this video. How does this little sensor is used, or its voice is heard by the computer, and it makes a significant difference to how the engine runs? Well, when the engine starts cold, we all know, or you might have heard, that engines run rich. Well, the reason for that is cold fuel doesn't ignite as good, and it just tends to linger and doesn't really work as much as warm fuel or warm combustion chamber or warm everything for that matter. So when the engine starts, you're in something called open loop. And the loop is the computer listening to the oxygen sensor input. When it's open loop, it ignores this guy. It sometimes even ignores the mass airflow sensor, which we talked about in the previous video. All it does is it goes by a pre-programmed program that we're going to put this much fuel until the engine reaches this temperature. But in reality, what it's trying to do is it's trying to give this guy time to warm up. So the input from the AF sensor, air fuel ratio sensor, I will abbreviate it as AF sensor. So the input from the AF sensor is accurate. And it's trying to warm up the catalytic converter. It's trying to warm everything up. And you notice Toyotas, when you start them, the RPM will rise. And the reason it rises, most people wonder, why does Toyota rise their RPM when they're cold? Isn't that bad because it's going to run the engine higher and the oil is trying to circulate? Well, that rise in RPM does so many things. The first one is it helps circulate that oil faster. The second thing, and the most important, it's trying to warm up the engine. The O2 sensor, even though it has a heater, is going to still try to blast it with as much hot air as possible to warm it up. And the most important thing, to warm up the catalytic converter. Catalytic converters don't work very well when they're cold. More on that episode. The minute this sensor reaches a temperature that the computer is happy with, and the signal that's coming out of it is plausible, that's another term you will hear, it switches to closed loop operation. Your RPM drops down, and that doesn't mean that the engine is fully warmed up to operating temperature. No, over the years, this has been a race between auto manufacturers. Who can get into closed loop the faster? The faster you get into closed loop with engine control, the better emissions or the less harmful emissions you will get out of the car when it's an open loop operation. Now, there are times while the engine is running, it'll go into open loop momentarily and it'll come back. That is normal, but for the most time, it'll try to stay in closed loop operation. So, let's talk about closed loop. Here's what happens in closed loop. The computer cannot control how much air is coming in because that's based on the mechanical part on your throttle input. What it can do though is change the injection volume. You remember we talked about fuel injectors. It can open that injector for a longer duration, more milliseconds equal more fuel sprayed. That it can control. But how does it know exactly how much to put? It's looking at the input from this guy. Now comes the tango dance, if you would. Here's how the computer is going to have a dance with the air-fuel ratio sensor and the injection volume or the direction of the injectors. And follow me closely here because this is going to get slightly not simple but complicated. The computer will put a specific amount of fuel based on the input that it gets from the mass airflow. I have this much air, I want to put this much fuel to get to my 14.7 to 1 stoichiometric, that perfect ratio between the two. It's going to put that in the engine, it's going to do the cycle, the exhaust comes out. This sensor is just sitting like this, very upset. Too rich, you put too much fuel, the computer will go in a frenzy. No, let's cut the fuel. It's going to cut the fuel. Just keep cutting slowly. Remember, the engine is turning at a high revolution. This happens in milliseconds. It's going to cut the fuel back. Just keep cutting the fuel. It's waiting for this guy to say, yep, we're good. But guess what? This guy never say it's good because that ratio is such a narrow window that it'll never exactly be there and hold it. Okay, everybody go drink your coffee and we're done. No, it's going to say, this guy is going to say, the air fuel ratio is going to say, too rich. The computer will say, okay, well, let's cut the fuel back. It cuts the fuel back, and then this guy all of a sudden says, nope, we're too lean now because you cut too much. It's going to go, okay, well, let's start adding. And then until this cycle keeps going back, forth, and they just keep chasing themselves after that as you are in your drive-through of McDonald's getting a $1 menu burger. These guys are doing all this while you're just sitting in your car, driving, not thinking anything is going on. It just keeps adding fuel until this guy says it's too much, cuts back, add, cut back, add, cut back. What it's trying to do is it's swinging back and forth around the perfect 14.7 to 1. It can never keep it perfectly there because of the mechanical nature of the engine. It's trying to just swing back and forth. So here's 14.7 to 1. It's going to hit it, go away, hit it, come back. So when you look at the signal of these O2 sensors, you'll see that it's up, down, up, down, up, down. It just keeps going up, down, up, down. And the injection volume, if you really dig into it, it's also doing the same thing. It's just going rich, lean, rich, lean, rich, lean. Too much fuel, too little fuel, too much fuel. It just keeps going like that all day long. As long as the engine is running, it's doing that dance, that tango dance, back, forth, back, forth. So that is essential to your diagnosis because there's a moment when we have problems. Look, when the cars are running great, if your car never has a problem ever, why are we having all this? Why do I have a job and why are you working on your own car? At some point, something is going to go south and you are greeted by the warmth glow of the check engine light. So I want you to understand the basics. Let's say you're driving, a mouse came under the hood, chewed up a vacuum line. Here's what's going to happen. You have a vacuum leak now. Now the engine is always running lean. Here's what's going to happen. The engine will, okay, we're getting this much air. I put this much fuel. The angry guy, the air fuel ratio sensor says, nope, you're too lean. Okay, well, let's add more fuel. It's expecting it to say, okay, now you went too rich, so we can go back. But we're adding more fuel to compensate for that lean. Nope. This guy says, we're still lean. Keep adding. Nope. We're still lean. keep adding, nope, we're still leaning. And then the computer says, whoa, hold on, I don't like what's going on here. My mass airflow is saying one thing and you're saying something else. You guys need to come and have a sit down and let's talk, because I don't like what's going on here. Even though the computer is doing all this dances because of these two guys, but he's still the boss. He's going to tell them, hey guys, I don't think you guys are on the same page here. Stop this whole operation, go back to open loop. I don't like you guys. Loose nut behind the wheel gets a warm glow of the check engine light. That's how this works. And it could be the opposite way, where you have a leaking injector that's just spraying all the time. And same thing, the computer cuts back, and this guy keeps saying, we're rich. And then the computer says, okay, I don't like this. We're going to throw a code. So to summarize all this, I want you to take the following from this. The air-fuel ratio sensor, it's a vital input to the computer. It is basically the report card of how the computer is doing from the other input. It gets the stuff from the input from the mass airflow. This is how much air we're getting. This is how much fuel we're adding. But when the air-fuel ratio says, oh no, you're going too rich, the computer will react, will ignore the mass airflow and say, yeah, you'll be fine. Let's just cut the fuel a little bit because this guy says we're too rich. And then all of a sudden this guy says, oh, we're too lean now. Okay, well, let's go the other way. It just keeps back, forth. I just want you to visualize that it's going back, forth, up, down, all the time, because it's trying to keep us in that stoichiometric. Let's talk about some DIY stuff. Things that you will not find in a book. Things that I learn as we go, and I'm going to share with you. Did you know that all oxygen sensors are actually 22 millimeter size to take them off? So most people will go, oh, you need that special socket that has the cutouts or the wire will go through it and this and that. And there are cases where you do. And some people will say you have to be that cool mechanic that has that special socket, even though it's $5 on Amazon. But if you have in certain scenarios where this sensor is just sitting there, you can take a 22 millimeter wrench, put it over the sensor, break it loose. That's as simple as that. You don't need any. You're going to use a 22 millimeter wrench on a car, on a Toyota, a lot. Alignments, suspension stuff. It's a good wrench size to have, especially in an open end and a box end. So here is one that will really be useful if you're working with a semi-older car. Let's say 2000s, mid-2000s to late 2000s, even into the 10th. You go to replace an O2 sensor. By the way, common stuff for Toyotas are heater codes. The heater just fails. What makes these heaters fail usually is if you spray them with brake cleaner. For some reason, brake cleaner damages the heater in here and the heater is done. You get a heater code, you check all your wiring. Wiring is good. You're getting the voltages when you start the car cold, but you still have the heater code because the heater is damaged. You replace the sensor. Now you go to take the sensor out and you turn it. It turns a little bit, then stops. It gets real tight. You start turning it, and it's a struggle. Well, what happens with these, and it's common, is the threads get locked to the manifold or the exhaust where you're taking them out of. Here's a trick that you'll never find in any book, and actually might not find unless you work at a Toyota dealership with older mechanics. When this happens to you, you loosen it and it stops. Stop right there. Soak the threads, whatever is exposed of the threads, with brake fluid. Not brake clean, not PB Blaster or some WD-40, whatever. Brake fluid. Just soak this guy up and let it sit for 5 minutes. Come back in, tighten it a little bit, and loosen it. It'll come right out. Now, it might come out with like trash from the old thread on the exhaust. You need a thread chaser. Find the right size. They're everywhere. Just O2 sensor thread chaser. And clean the thread a little bit and install your new sensor. All these new sensors, when they come in, they come with a little cap, especially the AF sensors. They come with a little cap and NICs on them. Keep that NICs, don't take it out, because that's why they started doing this. Older ones didn't have that. So they seize up, like that, and that NICs is not any NICs. Do not go using any NICs. If you take this out for whatever reason, use any NICs. That's a special high temperature NICs. Leave it on there. And the most important thing about DIY repairs, you will not buy an aftermarket O2 sensor, or worse, AF sensors. I have seen so many O2 sensors installed where an AF sensor should be. Folks, these don't work the same. They look the same, and just because it fits, it doesn't mean it ships. That's not how this works. Whatever sensor you get that comes with 4 wires hanging off of it, and you make your own, fits every single car, that's the one that doesn't work. It needs to be designed for this car, and especially AF sensors. O2 sensors, a lot more forgiving. AF sensors, always buy the original, or buy a Denso, a known brand, but always have a way back, because it's very common that I see that you install this aftermarket sensor or whatever you got it, and it doesn't work flat out of the box. Not because it's a bad part, but because it's not for this car. Just thought you'd need to know this, and don't forget the brake fluid trick. And I will cover a lot more in-depth diagnosis and tricks and tips and all this stuff in an upcoming video, which we will cover advanced diagnosis. So, having said all that, in the following video of this series, we're going to stop learning and we're going to go into a different mode of learning. We're actually going to be looking at live data on the car. So we talked about all these different sensors and how they're reacting, how they're doing everything. Now, the next video, we're going to take a step back and get a car. We're going to look at some data, live data, through a scan tool, so you can see with your own eyes how these sensors are reacting. And then I will create some problems or start changing things, and I want you to see rich and lean how the computer reacts and how it starts adjusting things. Until we get to that video, I hope you liked this one. I hope you learned something new. If you did, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. And until the next part of this series, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have a wonderful day.